I'm Dennis Crouch again. Daniel Kochan is coming to us from Chapman Law School. What? Donald, not Daniel. Donald. Donald Kochan is coming to us from...
Depends on how good my speech is.
From,
you decide from Daniel or
Right. So as soon as I met Donald last night, I pulled him aside because he's written some interesting articles on recordation of property, right? Which him and I think, are the only people who are really interested in that topic. And part of it kind of goes to show kind of the breadth of his scholarship, and that he's written in kind of just standard real and personal property contexts about the theory of property, the practice of property, but then getting into natural resources, environmental law, also in the international law context. And also has some interesting works in kind of jurisprudence, how we make decisions, and to some extent kind of just statutory interpretation articles. So across the board in different fields. I don't know. I didn't talk with Donald about this characterization, but maybe can we characterize your take as more on the conservative side than the usual law professor?
I would say the conservative libertarian side.
Right. Okay. Right. Conservative. Right. And so this is a different take than Most folks who go into environmental law are choosing that because they have a liberal bent and they want to protect the environment and then they don't like these businesses that are ruining the environment. And so so Daniel's take is a little bit different than that, right? And maybe he's going to talk about that some here. He obviously has this great academic background like all of our speakers, and so I'm not even going to go into that, but let's just welcome Donald Kochan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I hope to convince you by the end of this that perhaps economics and environmental protection are not mutually exclusive, so that there are people who can go into environmental law with a design to try and improve the environment, but perhaps from a different angle. And in that sense, I've described this as the economic perspectives on the fourth generation of environmental law. My goal will be to try and stay within the framework of this conference so far and present perhaps the substitute of the title might be Economic Challenges to Implementation of Adaptive Approaches and Environmental Possibilities through Embracing Economics. All right, so in part you're going to see that that's going to rest on my approach. I couldn't really decide whether or not Professor Berry had asked me to do a law and economics approach. So I didn't really get a chance to decide whether or not I wanted to do a positive side or a normative side. So at the risk of going fast, I will give you a little bit of both. So to the extent that, to describe what I mean by that is, I'll talk a little bit on the normative perspective of law and economics. And that is, how can economics actually influence the creation of legal rules? How can they lead to the optimal legal rules? How can we infuse economic principles into deciding what the best rules should be? On the positive side, and this is going to be my more pessimistic side at the end, it's going to be what can economics teach us about the possibilities of actually achieving those goals? And in part, that's going to be an institutional and interest group analysis, and an attempt to sort of understand what are the barriers that we have within the realities of institutions and the reality of interest groups. And I want to talk about, and I want to lay out, I'm more on the libertarian side in a sense, because I want to lay out the fact that I'm going to be talking about sort of the barriers that both businesses pose as well as environmental groups, because both of them are sort of after their own independent interests, and both of them are going to be, in ways, obstacles to any type of environmental reform, no matter how you phrase it, or no matter how you essentially create the architecture. You're going to have these competing interest groups who are not necessarily going to be as enlightened as this group of individuals in this room and know what is best. And in that sense, hopefully by the end of this, we'll see where some of that comes into play. So I start from this quote from a October, or I guess winter, spring 2013. Perk reports economics could learn something from Charles Darwin, and ecology could evolve from revisiting Adam Smith. Indeed, Charles Darwin bred Smith, so there's an ancestral connection between the two fields. They both stress the emergence of phenomena rather than their direction from above, and there's much activity in evolutionary biology and ecology that is parallel to what is occurring in economics, and vice versa. Nobel laureate F.A. Hayek, Friedrich Hayek knew this and went across to the evolution of pinch ideas. So there's fruitful dialogue between ecology and economics and plenty of room for more. And I think that there's this topic about adaptation is definitely a fruitful dialogue to include economics, because economics is about what? Adaptation, right? It's about the flexibility, it's about independent decision making and responding to changes. And I think that that in part is where I'm going to come down about the superiority of at least grounding things at a sort of what I call a weighted principle toward economic ideas in the development of adaptive rules. So, must there be competition between ecological and economic values? I don't think so, and hopefully by the end of this we'll have a robust discussion on whether or not that's true. Some of the things that I'll be discussing today include markets, private ordering, economic principles, utility of property rights, and the utility of economic growth. So all of these things come into what I mean by sort of how do we infuse or how do we consider economics? What questions should we be asking about the economic role in the fourth generation, or any generation for that matter? I think in my concluding slide I say that there's not all that much new that's being applied here, but I think that there's a greater opportunity if there's sort of a willingness to embrace adaptivity. Because there's sort of a welcome. It almost seems like a welcome, like economics, come in. You know, we might accept you, and that's much different than that's a little different than say the first generation, or at least as the first generation has been categorized, which is we know that economics is what got us here, right? Got us into this horrible environment last. So, 4 generations, I'm not really going to repeat this, I'm just going to be going along the same ideas of what you've heard all day today. So I'll be categorizing them in much the same way. I'm going to be focusing primarily on the first, second, and fourth, not so much on the third. In part, by the end of this, I'm going to tell you why the second is often used as that was the pinnacle of economic integration into environmental policy. Well, I think that a lot of it was sort of for show. I don't think that there's a lot that was going on in the market incentives that were actually being infused in that sense. I don't think cost-benefit analysis really does all that much good. Hopefully I'll have enough time to get to some of those things by the end of this. So, we do have a better environment today, so this is where you don't throw eggs at me, right? I do think that there's a lot of good things that have come out of our approaches over time. And so I want you to understand that I do believe we have a better environment today, and in part that is because of the impetus of the state, that is because of the impetus of certain interventionist techniques. Now, do I think that perhaps we went too far at different points in time? Do I think that there's a time now, if ever, for greater infusion of economic principles? Certainly. Particularly that third bullet point, do new technologies open up new alternative approaches? And I think new technologies not only open up new alternative regulatory approaches, but some of the skepticism about the capacity of economics to actually resolve environmental problems are being minimized, I contend, by the existence of new technologies, for example, the ability to allocate property rights into various resources, etc. So, this is, for those who are fans of Downton Abbey, I just throw this in because I had this phrase that I came up with, sometimes you have to get your dress dirty to save the pigs. And I wanted to find a way to use it, and it seems appropriate here, right? Sometimes you have to get your dress dirty to save the pigs. So if you're not a fan of Downton Abbey, I'm sorry, you should be. But if the idea here is that there are some landed individuals in England, and they go out last Sunday in this episode, for anyone who saw it, they find out that their pigs are dying because they're
By the way, I haven't watched this episode.
Oh, spoilers. This doesn't ruin it because I won't tell you about the love affair that starts after. But in any case, there's a need to go out and save the pigs, and so these landed individuals who are above this, go out and save it because they can't find their pig man, and the pigs are going to die, and so they go out and get all dirty. But if you didn't see it, I guess it probably will fall short somewhere. But in any case, my point here is the second thing, that environmentalism is clothed in a pretty dress and in some ways afraid of getting its narrative and philosophy a little dirty by accepting the modal alternatives to save, other modal alternatives to save the earth. Perhaps advocates of economic approaches are also a little afraid of getting their economic cloaks soiled. That's the critique that we can discuss at the end about the economics part. One of my main objectives here is to describe that the dress that the economic approach dons may in fact have some merit. We do need adaptability, and so I have some things from Professor Arnold's works pointed up here in the past. Most of this you've heard about polycentrism and other things, and the need for adaptability I agree with, that's the only way, in fact, that we can address these things, that it is far too complex to understand this in some sort of unimodal approach, or even from a sort of tunnel visioned or siloed approach that we see ultimately going around. So some of the themes of the fourth generation that I see is this idea of the recognition of the interconnected social, legal, and ecological systems. All this is again from Professor Arnold and Gunderson's work, adaptability of the environmental law and regulation, integrationist multimodality, rejecting fragmentation and unimodality. New approaches are not merely additive or competitive, but will be facilitative and transformative force, and polycentric regulation. I'm going to kind of take those up a little bit later, and I just want to put those out there. So the challenge on adaptability that Professor Arnold and Gunderson have placed in front of us is this idea is whether we can learn from this and achieve sort of reform with adaptation. And you've heard about the definitions of multimodality and integrationist multimodality, so I'll skip past those. Now, the markets and economic approaches have a comparative advantage in adaptability, is my contention. And the reason why is it's adaptive and integrationist approach have their merits, but the aims of those approaches are best served by non-interventionist alternatives, and particularly because markets are the most adaptive and flexible, they're capable of making quick adjustments, they foster tailored solutions. There's this idea that if you're on the ground, you can change things, you don't have to go through a bureaucratic process, you know, it can be quicker, it's more agile, and in that sense, if you indeed can find the market solutions, and that's going to be tough. I don't pretend like these are going to be easy answers. I'm going to present to you a few of the options. But if you can find them, I do think that this idea of adaptability sort of calls economics to the forefront. And this polycentric law is described safeguards against duplication of inefficient multi-jurisdictional, multifaceted approaches, it's argued. But at the same time, these political and regulatory systems are by their very nature resistant to adaptation. Right, and I contend that environmental groups and businesses are resistant to adaptation as well. So I don't know that you can get buy-in from all the individuals that you might want. And when I say buy-in from all the necessary stakeholders in this, I'm talking about the regulators as well as the interest groups, especially because and this is recognized in some of Professor Arnold's work as well, and that is that we have some of these biases in favor of unimodal. We have people that have vested interest in their own perspectives. We have environmentalists who don't want to get their dress dirty, right? They don't, with different philosophies. They truly do believe that the adaptive approach isn't necessary, that we really do need to have a greater preservationist, for example, idea. We'll talk a little bit more about bureaucracy theory and interest group theory in a few moments. Optimal adaptability. I question whether or not indeed we should embrace spontaneous order as creating the optimal adaptability. And spontaneous order is a phrase that you will hear throughout economic analysis. And it's the idea that if you set a goal, if you have objectives in mind, and you allow free forces to go forward, they will figure out what the order is. They'll figure out what the most efficient order is, and that they'll adapt as it goes along. If in fact you learn from your mistakes, you get natural feedback loops rather than requiring them to be in fact ordered through some sort of regulatory structure. And so the feedback loops come through the price system, they come through other mechanisms of the markets. Consider markets now in relation to four generational themes. We kind of can think about that if you adopt a more market-oriented approach, you would have a caution toward regulatory approaches, embrace incentive structures, the development of property rights, the pricing of resources and rights, tradability of rights. Valuation of harms becomes important, because if you can't figure out what the actual harms are worth, then the compensation schemes that I talk about in the next point aren't going to make a difference. And again, that's a difficult challenge, but I think that we at least need to try in the first instance to see whether or not these are possible. At the end of this talk, I'll talk to you a little bit about why perhaps I'm saying we should mandate that these approaches be considered first before we move into others. Crowding out markets is one of the concerns I have about the adaptability approach and the polycentric approach, and this is another economic concern. I do believe that if you start to believe that economics can play a significant role, in fact, I contend the primary role should be with economics, then you have the crowding out of economic approaches, because if indeed you have polycentric ideas, and so you have some federal regulation, some state regulation, some local regulation, other different types of approaches, that will minimize the amount of options in the market. Some of them are going to be either the resources are going to be diverted, so you can't actually devote things to market experimentation, or more likely what the fact is that some things will become command and control, because it's not eliminated if it's cumulative. Some things will become command and control, which means it leaves out some of the options that you might have to take market approaches. So I do think that markets in a way become in an inferior position because they need sort of that flexibility at the outset and open freedom to experiment without having the constraints. Therefore, I talk about the mix as not necessarily being best. By necessity, the integration of this multimodal or polycentric approach will require more inclusion of private ordering and market approaches. If done honestly as described, it seems to me policymakers would need to give serious credit to and evaluate such solutions. Unfortunately, in that effort, too many of the anti-market biases and bureaucratic turf protection will pervade the integrationist approach. That is, if you have this idea of sort of set ways and set preferences that are impeding these things, and you continue to have a role for those people who are anti-market in this polycentric approach, that they will dominate the debate. And though you may go to the toolbox, you'll find that the economic tools might get hidden by the other folks. Right. So how do we ensure these things? It's tough to answer. How do we ensure that they'll actually go into play? As I think that if you look at some of the work, I think that it's not a foregone conclusion that these things are going to work. I've talked about some of these other points as well. In the polycentric approach, as I've seen it described, markets and economic solutions are not weighted, and they don't have special significance. And my proposal at the end of this will be to give them that thumb on the scale, that there should be a thumb on the scale in favor of economic approaches, and then only if you see the market failures do you actually go to other polycentric approaches. And I think that would allow for an embrace of an adaptive model, but with certain preferences at the outset. And the erosion of traditional property rights, even if only gradual, which Professor Arnold talked about a little bit earlier today, to me runs counter to the benefits of the economic growth aspects that you can get from, the economic growth aspects that you can get from a robust system of property rights, and it also eliminates our ability to use property rights to allocate resources and to identify how much certain things can be worth and create tradable rights. So I think that if there's going to be an erosion, it is somewhat problematic. And that gets me to, I'm going to spend about 5 minutes now just talking about some of the approaches that markets and economic approaches might see, market mechanisms that can come into play. So even if where there's at first maybe even a perceived market failure, it might be correctable by state mechanisms like classic overgrazing examples in the tragedy of the commons, and the ability to look to property rights. So this was the statement from Professor Arnold earlier today: property rights can be entitlements against change, and I think that indeed sounds a little bit dangerous to me, because I do think that we have to embrace a stronger system of property rights if indeed we are going to properly allocate resources along the way. So must we weaken property rights? I think that unless I see a limiting principle, and even if I did, I might be against, I'm not sure, but to the extent that there's no limiting principle, I'm not sure where you draw the line, and I do think that a robust system of property rights is necessary. And these points have already been made, that if you erode property rights, you go in the other way. So how do property rights fit within an economic model of environmental protection? If you create secure and certain property rights, they will facilitate investment in conservation. People understand the rights and are willing to invest in valuable conservation resources. So people will start to value things. If you can allocate things, they will start to invest in them. You see this with certain species and habitat issues, and so there are some experiments. Fisheries is another big example. Private forestation projects have been largely successful in this regard. And so those are some of the last examples, and we can talk about that in the Q&A period if you want. I want to make sure I get some of the other positive analysis stuff. But new technologies can also help us create more sophisticated property rights regimes, and Morris and Yad will talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we can start to isolate air, isolate water rights in a way that we can allocate those to individuals and then can have tradability along the way. So these are some of the ways that you can do it. Next thing, end subsidization of bad behavior. And I mean it. I mean end subsidization of bad behavior no matter who it is. That means businesses shouldn't get subsidies, and environmental groups shouldn't get subsidies. We should just get rid of it all and allow proper allocation. There's a misallocation of resources in society as a result of subsidization. Planning doesn't work. Subsidies are planning, and subsidies lead to artificial and inefficient allocations of resources. I mean, what planner can decide how much, in fact, something is worth? Instead, we should allow the market to price things. Farming subsidies, for example, have actually backfired. You may like farming, think it's it's an environmental cause or something of that sort, but it's led to over-farming. You see a lot of wetlands destroyed as a result of farming subsidies and other destruction of resources along the way. And you can look at Rule and Adler and others pointing that out. Other subsidies, like for oil, decrease the cost of production. and therefore they lead to over exploitation of the resource. They also lead to a little incentive to look at alternative energies, right? So if you eliminate the subsidies for certain fuels, you will in fact maybe make people think about doing something else, right? I mean, if you're cozy and you're comfortable in your current industry and you're getting paid to produce that by the government, then why would you change? So I think that I'm an equal opportunity subsidy ender. All right, so end all subsidies. Economics counsels private investment driven by private incentives and private monitoring, and there should be a real level playing field. Common law remedies. So there is a way that we can, and this may be difficult to implement, and we don't have time to go into how exactly we do this, but certainly common law remedies and nuisance and trespass and expanding those and really coming out with experimentation in our common law remedies to find ways in which we can create more targeted polluter pays type common law remedies that in fact go to the actual contributors, rather than having sort of an entire industry or an entire section penalized for their activities. We should create more culpability requirements and otherwise try and target those things. So here again, this demonstrates how market solutions can fit into the integrationist model or polycentric approach. It doesn't mean that, I mean, even if someone wants to accept that there are other things going on, I do think that, again, there's the crowding out problem, but certainly if you're going to integrate some of them, this could be those. Reducing the portfolio of public lands is a hot topic. I love to talk about it, but it's way too long to talk about today. But if we took management of public lands outside of governmental hands, I think that just like other property rights regimes, we could lead to greater environmental allocation, or better, more optimal environmental allocations. So that gets me to one of the last things I want to talk about on the normative side, and that is the second generation issues from an economic perspective. I do think that sometimes, and I see this from those who sort of want to say, look, your ideas are taken into account, right? We have OIRA, we have Regulatory Flexibility Act, we have SBREFA, we have all these other great things that take economics into account. Well, takes into account is a very weak standard, first off. It's not action-inducing, it doesn't have really requirements that the better economic approach be adopted. And so I would just say that there's limitations, risks, and dangers. These things lack teeth. They're information gathering to a large part, but not always action-inducing. And the mirage is the bigger problem. The mirage is that, look, we are doing economics, right? We have a cost-benefit analysis. OIRA approved our program. And therefore, it's sort of an escape valve for those who want to believe they're doing good economic analysis. Last thing, economic growth. I stand by, or I believe in the studies which show that generally the most prosperous nations actually are the ones who have the greatest level of environmental protection for a variety of reasons. You have greater disposable income, which can lead to spending on environmental goods. You have greater protection of human rights and greater sort of incentives to conserve. And so, as a general idea, we should try and be improving the economy, which generally improves the environment. All right, so my proposal, and this you'll have to save largely for the paper, I think, when that comes out, which will be given to the editors, and who I want to thank for doing this symposium, by the way. But the proposal that I have is that we should have some, similar to a NEPA type idea, but it should, or perhaps similar to some other of these less effective mechanisms that I've been talking about before, but perhaps a filtering rule, right? A filtering rule which would require that agencies have to make some determination of market failure, and then a secondary determination of market incompatibility with the environmental goal that is being adopted, and then the third thing would be that they have to find that there is no way that they can use market mechanisms or the creation of market mechanisms, like the creation or recognition of new property rights, to achieve the goal. If that is true, then go to the next set of the next tools in the toolbox. All right. So the basic idea would be to have some sort of review, which would also be open to economists to comment on, and the economists and then a requirement that agencies respond in comments as to why there would be a market failure. And so they would have to prove the market failure before, in fact, agencies could proceed. This would add rigor to the process and ensure that, in fact, that thumb was on the scale in favor of a market solution if it could be accomplished. And if there's a way that there is minimal state involvement that would push the market approach, then that could be adopted as well. And so I can make these slides available at another point in time, and again, the paper will have more details about what I think could occur here. The difference between this and the Arnold and Gunderson 2013 suggestion for an adaptive approach is that at least as preliminarily formatted here, we would accept that the polycentric integration as a multimodality approach should be utilized, but only after such analysis and only coupled with a presumption for and thumb on the scale in favor of a market solution. All right. And so if we could, that might actually make economics a real part of the toolbox. So, plenty of benefits to the proposal, but I've largely done. So now's time, and this I just added before this, now time for some Gen X pessimism. I will be the Generation X person who has not lost my pessimistic traits. And that is this idea of the limits on legal capacity. And there's some in Professor Arnold's work and others that recognize this as well, that the law does have some barriers to some of these processes. Maladaptive nature of law, the ultimate questions as to whether or not the system can change. Agencies need legal authority to adapt, and is another point that was made in one of Professor Arnold's pieces. Perhaps they need that authority, but if they have the authority, will they adapt? And I think that's a separate question, and I'm not sure that it's yet been answered. And so law's resilience is what I really wanted to talk about. The idea, if we're going to talk about resilience, law's resilience is one of those things. We take the definition from earlier today, the capacity of a system to adapt to disturbances while retaining its core functions and structure. Well, the disturbances is the adaptation model, right? That's the disturbances for the legal system, the bureaucracy. It's disturbing their comfy, existence of regulatory existence. And so if you believe the idea of bureaucracies tend to perpetuate themselves, right? Niskanen and others. And if you take these theories that, in fact, bureaucracies want to perpetuate themselves, they have a tendency to increase their budgets, they want job security, that they in fact have to justify their own existence so that they will continue to thrive, that more regulations equals more work, which equals more expansion of the agency, and all that's good from a law and economic standpoint. Looking at bureaucracies, say that bureaucracies are indeed self-interested. Bureaucrats are self-interested. They are, and I apologize to bureaucrats in the room. But that you want to maximize your own self-interest, and therefore you want to keep your jobs, and your jobs are threatened indeed by some of the market approaches. And so there is a tendency of this resistance and resiliency within bureaucracies that comes into play. So this entrenchment idea of bureaucracies is one of the most resilient ways in which the adaptive material may, in fact, never come to bear. And so we have to recognize that reality from the administrative side. So the resilience of bureaucracies is also recognized at times that the system seems to operate its primary functions to promote the resilience of the legal system itself, and I concur with that. And I think that it's even more evident if you start to understand this the theory of bureaucracy. So the challenge remains to find a way to overcome those barriers if we can. I don't know what those are, but I think that we need to recognize these institutional barriers, because no matter if you believe my economic approach or if you believe that there's some better mix in the toolbox of polycentrism, then you still need to recognize the institutional realities of both the administrative agencies as well as legislatures. So the last thing about the administrative side of this is that administrative agencies have reason to create subterfuge. They have a reason to mask what they're doing. And so you can see, you may in fact have a lot of great words about adaptivity and about collaboration and coordination and feedback and all these other things built into the regulations, but you have to be sure that there's actually substance behind them, because sometimes they will use words as a way to placate those who in fact want to see the fourth generation done in form, but is it going to be done in substance? And I think that you see some of that concern. And then capture. The idea that administrative agencies tend to be captured by those who they regulate. Some administrative agencies are captured by environmental groups as well, it might be contended. And so, again, especially if those groups are not necessarily going to buy in, even if you talk about environmental groups, there's no guarantee that environmental groups in fact believe that adopting the fourth generation approach or trying to embrace it would in fact be in their best interest. And so those groups themselves may in fact not be supportive of the agencies taking a different direction. And so if the agencies are beholden to those groups, then the agencies are also going to be resistant. And again, if they can be resilient, then that's even better. And everyone, the basic idea is everyone's an interest group now. This is the Orange County Airport right before I flew in here. It's time for advertising Earth Justice, right? So we have, and part of that goes to the idea that environmental groups are interest groups too. And I don't think that you can take, public choice theory talks about interest groups who want to maximize their own interests, and as well as the interests of their members. And there's a piece that St. Louis University Law Journal masking that just went to the printer now, but you can also grab it off SSRN, the Mask of Virtue. I go through there and I explain all the reasons why environmental groups, in fact, act in the same rational ways that businesses do to maximize their own budgets, to show successes to their membership so they can get more dues, and the successes come in obtaining regulation, the successes come in obtaining litigation, successes against the big bad businesses, etc. So they are going to be involved in the process of altering the rules that we ultimately create. The interest group theory posits then, as I've explained, that even if we could identify optimal policy and the right approach and the best policies, getting those implemented rather than interest group bargains is extremely difficult. We will get either what the businesses want or what the environmental groups want, and that's not necessarily what we in this room want. All right, no matter what that might be. So we have the basic idea of concentrated benefits, dispersed costs. If indeed interest groups can invest in obtaining legislation or regulation, if they can invest in obtaining legislation or regulation at a lower cost than what they could by bargaining on the free market, right? So if an environmental group wants to get a business to stop polluting, their definition of polluting, if they can spend $10 lobbying to get a regulation against this type of what they want to call pollution, but it would cost them $20 to buy that right on the market from the corporation. If they went and knocked on the door and said, hey, will you please stop that? Or, hey, I'd like to buy a servitude from you. The demand would be $20. Well, what's the environmental group going to do? They're going to spend the $10 getting the regulation rather than the $20 buying the right. And in that sense, there's this possibility of the incentive of going to the regulatory structure even when it might be more economically efficient to go through a market system. Now, the information asymmetry issue comes into play. Why does rent-seeking, this rent-seeking works? The rent in rent-seeking is the difference between the market price and the price that you have to pay to get the legislation or the regulatory outcome. So the rent is what you're seeking the differential, the saved money, in other words, that $10 difference. And so this rent-seeking is successful because there's information asymmetry, concentrate benefits, disperse costs. The idea of you're dispersing the costs to the entire populace so everyone pays a penny for that, or less than a penny, whereas your benefit is huge if you get the legislation that you wanted. So the people who pay the penny, they have no incentive to actually fight the legislation. So you have a dissymmetry there. The asymmetry in information is also that you as a general citizen don't know that this bargaining is going on. It's also often masked in great terms, right? It's masked in the idea that this is for the environment. Who's going to be against the environment? And so that's another reason why these interest group bargains become successful, and another reason why we should not expect necessarily the best policies, but instead those things which, in fact, people wish to pay for to obtain from the legislative process that they could not have obtained for the same price in the marketplace. And the masking concept just makes it work so that people don't complain. They don't really even know, right? If you can mask it, if you can put it behind a good gloss, a good shield, a good veil of environmental protection, then there's less resistance from the populace, and there's less transparency that this is actually an interesting bargain. But instead, to all of us, it just looks like a great adaptation of philosophy and adaptation policy that comes out of reading Professor Owen's work. So, pervasive. Interest group theory is pervasive. Everyone's an interest group now. I've talked about that before. And there's some recognition of this interest group phenomena in past work here as well. If we have interest groups on all sides, dangers to all types of approaches, including market-based solutions. So I think, as I've said this already, I think this makes it very difficult. It provides obstacles to implementing any of the adaptive or fourth generation approaches. It's provided obstacles to the first, second, and third generation as well. This is not anything all that unique, but it is something which we have to hopefully keep on our radar. I don't know if I have time to go through. I have 5 minutes? Okay. So let me just give you some examples and show you that, again, I'm an equal opportunity critic of interest groups, all right, whether they be environmental interest groups or businesses. I think neither of them should be able to engage in this process, and we should come up with some kind of way to create barriers. Of course, that's difficult. John Deere Husqvarna example. So John Deere goes out. This is the story in a nutshell. John Deere goes out. They think that they have a great new way to have to create a small engine. Right, small engines that are used in chainsaws essentially. So they've come up with this great new. Their scientists have told them we can do this great new engine that will have a very low level of pollutants. All right. So we go to the EPA and get them to promulgate a rule which requires that all chainsaws, all these particular small engines, have this pollution limit. All right. And so John Deere goes and they get this, and Husqvarna is upset because Husqvarna doesn't have the technology. They don't have the scientists, these brilliant people. Well, it turns out John Deere didn't either. And so they got EPA, in fact, to promulgate the rule and make it the industry standard. The reason why they got to make it the industry standard is because they thought they would get a competitive advantage on this. It wasn't because they cared about the environment. It's because they thought that they were the only, they had the patent on this one piece of technology. No one else did, which means everyone else's costs would go up. And so it was a way to essentially put them at a competitive advantage. That's one example of how, in fact, businesses go about this process. It doesn't necessarily mean you get the best rule. It turned out that John Deere actually couldn't produce the engine. And so I created all kinds of havoc along the way. We can talk more about that story after if you want. But that's the kind of way in which interest groups try to gain advantage. Business groups are not always just getting subsidies. Sometimes they're trying to get a competitive advantage that isn't necessarily, it sounds good for the environment. They were able to go to the EPA. It sounded good for the EPA too. They were aligned in their interest in doing so. And ultimately, if it had been successful, they would have had a significant market advantage. Environmental groups oppose because it's a threat to their existence and purposes. I've explained that before, that in fact, if the environmental groups their membership is judged by how many successes they can have. How do you judge successes? Well, it's the amount of regulations that you can influence or the amount of litigation that you can successfully bring. Businesses will try to minimize their liabilities under, for example, polluter pays and other market mechanisms. What that last point means is that I'm getting to the point where we're all doomed, even my proposal, because businesses, in fact, they will want to minimize their overall liabilities. So even if you adopt sort of some of these market-based approaches, they're going to try and go through the legislative process to minimize the options. They don't want polluter pays or other things. So, aside from this last proposal, in many ways, nothing I've said is new, as I said before. But at the very least, I hope that maybe we can make policy decisions that steer the fourth generation toward economic principles, that we can start to understand some of the economic barriers. So two things. I hope that economic principles, even if they don't become the predominant ethic in the fourth generation, that at least there's room for them, and as I said, they've been invited into the discussion. That's great. I do think that they should have a more weighted place, and if so, we could find ways in which their potential would be maximized. Independent of that, I hope that we keep economics in mind in understanding the institutional barriers and the realities, the political and institutional realities that might make any reform, no matter where we're coming from, difficult as a result of the incentive structure built into both administrative agencies and the production of legislation. So, with that, I'll take questions. Last thing, I forgot, my Valentine's Day tip. So, I believe in private ordering and I believe in charitable organizations and economic approaches to environmental protection. That is, things which don't require governmental intervention. One way is to give to charities and other things. So I'll tell you what I do on Valentine's Day, and this is a way that you can save money. You don't have to spend $70 on flowers or whatever it might be. Plant trees. So in any case, go to AmericanForest.org. You can plant trees, the equivalent of what you might give in roses. And you don't have to cut anything down and take it away from nature. In fact, you're putting it into nature. So this is one of my favorite charities, and it's what I do on Valentine's Day.
Given your skepticism about what truly goes on in agencies, your proposal for a NEPA-like market-favoring evaluation.
Doomed.
Okay. I was just thinking, well, given that skepticism, do you think that it's going to end up like some of the same arguments that are used with NEPA, kind of a paper tiger, and that eventually, once it's figured out how to go through the motions and find the right kind of language to consider alternatives, that it's not really necessarily forcing more informed or better decision making?
Absolutely. I think there's a serious risk of that, and part of the reason why I ducked it to say, hopefully it'll be in the paper, some of the responses to that. But let me tell you now, the only way that you can really get some of these procedural things to actually be more than paper tigers, especially in light of the incentive structures and the skepticism I have for taking these things seriously, is to create some type of constitutional type restraints, right? Something which is not necessarily, you have to eliminate discretion in certain ways. So the more costly it becomes to make the decision. So in that sense, it may create ossification problems and all that kind of stuff. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. I don't know. But the idea is that you have to find some way to discipline the agencies, and I don't pretend to have a great solution to that. They're going to be susceptible to some of these same problems. I do think that it at least creates. I mean, this is not all that unique of a proposal, I suppose. I think that in this context and the way it was framed in light of our discussion today is somewhat different. But everyone who knows NEPA, in fact, you have to take into account the costs on the human environment. And the costs on the human environment include economic costs, but you can't really think about economics, right? So the whole, and certainly you can't make a decision because it would be economically not harmful. So it's not even a weighing factor. So NEPA hardly takes into account economics at all. So at least perhaps we would add a little more teeth and a little more level playing field with the economic ecology balance. But and then the second sort of requirement is OIRA review, the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs review, which does cost-benefit analyses of all regulations, or at least all significant regulations. And so OIRA has to go through this process of evaluating what the economic impact is going to be, and then they essentially have to allow it to go through. It's information inducing, and it provides people with reasons why they might want to vote people out that were responsible for these agencies or what have you. But I'm skeptical of that being a real check. So the cost-benefit analysis that are required give us some information, but again, aren't action inhibiting. And I would want something that would be action inhibiting. That is, that it prevents you from doing things unless you prove something else, right? And so at least we would try to be putting something on top of that. And to the extent these things do work a little, then maybe this would work a little. Yes, in the back.
If it's desirable not to have intervention except in the case of a market failure, what are the characteristics of a market failure so we know that we're looking at one?
Yeah, the big problem is that's manipulable. All right, so the idea of what is or is not a market failure is manipulable, and that's one of the other limitations on this, or criticisms of trying to adopt this approach. The reason why I believe that we get a little bit closer to having some sincere determination of market failure, or at least more of a debate on what the market failure is if the commenting requirement is added to this. So that any economic analysis has to be allowed to be open for public comment. Those comments are also made public, and then the agency, and I didn't get to this part on there, but I would require that the agency would have to respond to the comments, which is the other economic analysis. So you'd have an academic debate on what is or is not a market failure there. So I don't think that there's a good way that's the best way I can think of right now to overcome the potential biases in favor of finding market failures when they don't really exist. And what are the component parts of a market failure that economists differ on? And I will tell you that in my view, the major idea is that there is some actual breakdown in the capacity of the market to create the solution in light of either information costs are too high, transaction costs are too high. The other way that it's really justified in environmental law is traceability is impossible, right? So if you have you have a lot of air pollution, you can't actually trace it to who did it. So therefore, that's what justifies a lot of our uniform one-size-fits-all kind of ideas of air and water pollution, is we don't know where it came from. Hopefully some of those things with new technologies we can say, well, traceability is easier to do now, and we no longer have that kind of market failure. So I think that I would leave that to the economists largely to determine, and then it would have to be a debate. And obviously you have a lot of debate between economists as to the appropriate role of government and when government intervention is justified, and that's also going to be a limitation on this being effective at being a non-intervention strategy. I'm not sure that answers your question.
No, we've gotten further along.
Okay. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was reminded of an interview that I listened to earlier this week with the climate economist William Nordhaus, and he's developed, I guess, a tax regime to tax CO2 emissions at all sources. It says the economics are sound. The wild card is human nature and whether or not there's the social or political will to implement such a tax regime that would take half the world's population in order for it to succeed. And you talked about interest group self-interest, and you talked about, well, if markets are given the flexibility, that they'll come up with a means of coming to a price for CO2 emissions. And I guess my doubts or cynicism is that the economic actors, those who benefit the most from CO2 emissions and pollution in general, don't have the initial or the economic incentives to price CO2 emissions.
I think that those kind of regimes they're hybrids, because you create a system in which it could be that it's much the same like cap and trade and other type systems as well. Is it creates a framework which now says, market, you're going to have to work it out and come up with prices. And so I think you might be correct that there are times when, if they're not shoved, the market's not going to price things. But if there's so maybe there's an appropriate time for the government to shove, and I can't, and obviously that is a less bright line than I would like. I would say that instead you create a system in which I would rather see incentives to rather than imposing taxes requiring prices. If you provide the right incentives for abatement techniques, for example, then that would be a way to then people would want to know what the price was, because because you want to know how much you've saved for the environment, right? So the better way, I did put up taxes because I think they're a second best alternative, but I would rather see, if you're going to, another, or maybe a third best alternative, a second best alternative would be an incentive structure which is funded by the government in a way in which you could actually determine what the reduction was by certain activities, which would incentivize the market to figure out what the price is, because they want to get paid. But I agree with you that there are times when the market doesn't want to price things, and that might be one of the situations where, if the market's not going to price something, that you at least need a shove, whether through its an incentive structure or a tax structure, which creates an economic benefit if they do, and either an economic benefit or minimizes an economic harm if they do price it. Does that answer?
Yes.
Closing?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.